If you open your Bible right in the middle, you'll be in the wonderful book of Psalms. Let me read you the end of Psalm 72. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who alone does wondrous things. May his glory fill the whole earth. Then comes an editor's comment. The prayers of David, son of Jesse, are ended. And after that, there's a title, Book 3. So there is more than one book of Psalms, in fact, 5 books of Psalms, 5 collections of songs and hymns and poems and prayers of the people of Israel. Some of the Psalms in books 1 and 2 are prayers of David, the son of Jesse, the shepherd boy who grew to be a general in King Saul's army and was later anointed king himself. David was king about 1000 BC. He brought together the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, made Jerusalem the capital around Mount Zion. He was a great king, but also sadly an adulterer and murderer, though he sought God's forgiveness for his sins. Many of the Psalms in books 1 and 2 come from David's time, but others come from different times over the next 400 years. Many were psalms, what we call laments, David's struggles with Saul, the poet's sins and forgiveness, illnesses and sorrows, battles with Israel's enemies. There is the lovely, reassuring Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. But there's the anguished Psalm 58. Why are God's enemies getting away with everything? There's the tender Psalm 42. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Hope in God. Book 2 ends with Psalm 72, which is a prayer for the king's son, probably Solomon, whose great achievement was to build a magnificent temple on Mount Zion. It had courtyards and gates and a central Holy of Holies which symbolized the presence of God. The temple became the very center of the worship of the people, and many of the psalms were sung in festival processions for the temple. Some of the directors of temple music had a hand in writing or editing some of the psalms. People like Asaph and the sons of Korah. Now the monarchy in Judah, good and bad, lasted right up to 587 BC when something terrible happened. Psalm 79 tells us what happened. O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. What was going on? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had conquered the land, devastated the capital, Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, stolen its gold treasures, taken them and many of the leaders of God's people off to exile in Babylon. Israel's monarchy was ended. All the symbols of God's presence were in ruins. Where was God now? Much of Book 3 is about these turbulent times, and there are prayers for God's help and a lot of questioning of what was going on. And one sad prayer from the exile is the very anguished Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? What had happened to all God's promises? Book 4 opens with a prayer which is linked to the great leader of the people many centuries earlier. It's called a prayer of Moses. The compiler of Book 4 wants the people to remember Moses, their leader at the time of God's great rescue from slavery in Egypt, the Exodus, Passover night, the crossing of the Red Sea, the years of wandering in the wilderness, and eventually arriving in their promised land. There are several Exodus psalms. They recall the history of God's people over those times with all its ups and downs, over the centuries. O God, you have helped us in the past. We trust you to help us again. Psalm 136, for example, traces all that history and turns those memories and remembrances into worship by adding after every verse, God's steadfast love endures forever. Book 4 also includes one very important thing. The Lord is King. After the exile, as we said, the monarchy in Israel and Judah was finished. The important thing was, the Lord is King. And a whole group of royal psalms celebrate the fact that the God of Israel, the creator of heaven and earth, is not only their King, but King of all nations, King of the whole earth. The Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. And finally, Book 5 includes 3 very interesting collections of psalms. There's a group of Passover psalms, which to this very day are still sung at Passover festivals. Jesus would have sung them at the Last Supper. Then there's a group of psalms called Songs of Ascents, many of which were probably processional hymns, as the pilgrims are returning to Jerusalem from Babylon. I lift up my eyes to the hills. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And Book 5 ends with a selection of hallelujahs, songs of praise to God from all people, all nations, from the whole of creation. So the Psalter, our book of 5 books, begins with psalms of lament and ends in songs of praise. These 5 collections of Israel's hymn books and prayer books, from the early days of King David to after the end of the exile, when God's people were returning home. Perhaps it even includes some from 100 years after that, the time when the temple was restored and Nehemiah rebuilt the city walls. The Psalms were written by people like us. One of the reasons why the book of Psalms has remained such an important part of Christian worship ever since, and of our individual spiritual lives, is the way they engage our emotions and open our imaginations. The Psalms are written by real human beings who feel, like we do, a sense of awe in the presence of God, feel shame and guilt when we've done wrong, a sense of injustice when evil people seem to get away with it. And yet there's hope in God's faithfulness and praise and thanksgiving for all the gifts and provisions of God's love. The psalm writers, like us, get hungry and lonely. They suffer and die. They sometimes let out cries of anguish. They're real human beings who, like us, can find God in the stillness and the silence, as well as in the joyful celebration of corporate worship. That's why the Psalms still speak to us. They tell us about Israel's faith in God as creator of heaven and earth. In God's law, they tell us of God's justice, God's rescue in times of trouble. We learn about the people's journey of faith, their hope in God's future, when Messiah will come, their longing for the day when justice and peace come together and God's glory fills the earth. Throughout, God's people are summoned to live as the people of God. God, whose word is their lamp and their light. God, whose spirit is their guide and their strength.